Welcome to Wildcat Science with Mrs. Haugo. This is Chapter 7, Part 1, the Skeletal System, Bones and Joints. So in class we'll be talking about the football player Reggie and his fractured femur. So let's start out with functions of the skeletal system. One function is to form a framework for the body. So without your bones, you would just be kind of a pile of muscles and goo, a bag of muscles. It wouldn't work very well. Another function is to protect structures like the brain. So your cranium does a very good job of protecting your brain. So the bones work a lot like levers, and they work with the muscles to produce movement. So without bones, you wouldn't be able to move. And they also store calcium, which is used by not just the bones in the skeletal system, but many other systems. And blood cell formation occurs here. We're going to be looking more into each of these later, but let's take a minute and look at bone structure. So we know that function and structure go together. So the skeleton has 206 bones, and the skeleton is divided into the axial skeleton, which is the central portion, and the appendicular skeleton, which are the extremities like arms and legs. Bones are classified by shape. There are flat bones, which have broad surfaces, like your ribs, scapulae, and cranium bones. And here is an example of a flat bone. If you see, these are quite flat. If we could break this cranium apart, we would see that the bones, even though they're curved, are very thin, and that's why we call them flat bones. Then there are short bones, which are more cube-like, like your carpals in your wrist, and you can see that these are kind of cube-like. You have irregular bones, which are all different shapes, and some examples are your vertebrae and your facial bones. So this is a vertebrae, and you can see how it is irregularly shaped. And finally, there are the long bones, which are long. We're going to go more in depth with that, but your femur in your leg and your humerus in your arm are some examples. So let's take a look at some of the bones and their bone shape. You have the parietal bone, which is one of the cranial bones here, and that is a flat bone. And then coming down, you have vertebrae, which is an irregular bone here. Also, the patella right here is an irregular shaped round bone. Then you have a long bone, which is the femur right here, and also the humerus in the arm. And coming down to the ankle, there is a short bone, the tarsal bone. So as promised, we're going to talk a little bit more about long bones. Two examples are the femur in the leg and the humerus in the arm. So they have diaphysis, which are the long, longitudinal, narrow shaft right here. And then they have two epiphysis, which are the expanded ends on either end. So there are different names for each of the epiphysis because we know that each bone has a proximal and a distal end, so they would have a proximal and distal epiphysis. So this would be the end closer to the middle of the body because this would be a hip joint on a cow, not a human. This isn't a human femur, but a cow. And so this would be the proximal end, and then this would be the knee joint, so this would be the distal end, or the distal epiphysis and proximal epiphysis. The epiphysis is what forms the joint. It's also called an articulation with another bone. And then inside the diaphysis is a hollow chamber, which is called the medullary cavity. And this contains inside here bone marrow. So let's talk a little bit more about bone marrow, which is a specialized type of connective tissue. If you remember from chapter 4, we talked about our 4 different types of tissue, and connective tissue was one of them. There are 2 types of bone marrow. Red marrow, which is found in spongy bone at the end of long bones and also in the center of other bones. And what is special about red bone marrow is that it makes bone cells. That's one of the major functions of the skeletal system, and we'll talk more about that later. The second type is yellow marrow, and that is found in the medullary cavity of long bones. So there's yellow marrow in here, and this stores adipose cells, which we know is another name for fat, and it also some white blood cell formation occurs there. Interesting fact, you don't have to write this down in red, but you should think about it, is that yellow marrow, this adipose here, is the last fat to be used in a starvation period. So if you were a hungry animal like a wolf, you may want to break open the bone and get at that good energy fat reserve. So let's talk about bone membranes. So one of the bone membranes is the periosteum, and if you recall back in chapter 4, we also talked about membranes. So the periosteum is the membrane covering the bone. So if this were a living bone, this would be covered with living tissue, with membrane tissue. So the periosteum contains cells for bone growth and repair, which are called osteoblasts. And then if we were to break this open and look in the medullary cavity, we would see the endosteum, which is the membrane covering the inside of the medullary cavity. On each epiphysis, there would be covered articular cartilage, and that is an area of hyaline cartilage that covers the articulating surface of the epiphysis, and that helps provide cushion for the joint. Also, another aspect is the epiphyseal plate. So the epiphyseal plate is also known as your growth plate, and that would be inside here where active growing of the bone is occurring while the bone is growing up until about the late teens, early 20s, depending on the individual. So let's look at some of the parts of the bone. So in this femur, we have the proximal epiphysis up here, the diaphysis, and then the distal epiphysis down here. And in the epiphyseal plate, this is where the active growth is occurring. And then covering the articulating surface is articular cartilage. And then in the epiphysis, there is spongy bone. And we know that spongy bone is where red marrow and where blood cell formation occurs. And then in the medullary cavity, we have, in the wall of the medullary cavity, we have compact bone. And we're going to talk a little bit more about the difference between spongy bone and compact bone. And inside the medullary cavity is the yellow marrow. And then covering the bone is our periosteum, that membrane, that living membrane that covers it. So let's delve a little bit deeper into bone tissue. So bones are made of living tissue. A lot of times people think that bones are hard and dead, but they are not. Since bones are made of tissue, a bunch of different tissues, each bone is itself an organ. So this is an organ, and this is an organ, and then each one of these bones is an organ. So osteocytes are bone cells, and they are alive. This is not something a lot of people think about, but they are indeed alive. So the spaces between the cells, between the osteocytes, are filled with hard calcium deposits, and that is what gives bones their hardness and strength that we normally think about. There are 2 types of bone tissue or osseous tissue. Compact bone, which is more compact, it's hard and dense, and as we talked about earlier, it is found in the wall of the diaphysis and the outer layer of other bones. And then the second type is spongy bone, and it has more spaces than compact bone. If you think back to the picture we looked at on the last slide, the spongy bone was in the epiphysis and it had lots of holes in it. So spongy bone is found in epiphyses and at the center of other bones that are not long bones. We're going to delve a little deeper into osseous tissue structure, or the structure of bone tissue. So let's start out with compact bone. And if you would like to reference on page 134, figure 7.3, that could be helpful. So osteocytes are organized in a ring around a central canal, also known as a Haversian canal. And remember, osteocytes are the bone cells. The central canal has nerves and blood vessels running through it. And the osteocytes are found in spaces, or lacunae, radiating out from the central canal. Mineral deposits of calcium salts make up the hard parts of bone, of osseous tissue. So let's talk about an osteon, which is also known as a Haversian system. It is a cylinder-shaped unit of compact bone tissue that surrounds a central canal, and it is considered the functional unit of bone tissue. So looking on page 134, if you see those osteons, or those cylinders, go up and down, and the orientation of osteons resists compressive forces, so it helps make the bone more resilient and stronger. And also, looking at that picture, you can see that the osteocytes can communicate with nearby cells, that there's little canals going between the osteocytes. There are blood vessels and nerves that go through the bone through the channels called perforating canals, or perhaps also Volkmann canals, and that helps nourish the bone. So there are nerves that go through bone, so if you break a bone, it will hurt. So let's look at some pictures. Looking at a picture of types of bone tissue, we can see here we have a long bone, and this is the diaphysis, and the wall is composed of compact bone, and there's a blown out picture here of it. And then the medullary cavity is here filled with nerves and blood vessels. And then there would be a periosteum on the outside, which you can see here. And then on the inside there would be another membrane, the endosteum. So looking at the blown up view, we can see the compact bone is made of these cylinders, which you may not be able to see it, it's hidden behind my face, but these are osteons. And then in the middle would be the osteonic canal with blood vessels and nerves. And you can see that these little red dots are the osteocytes, the bone cells, and they can communicate with each other. Also, there are blood vessels that go through the canals, and those are called your perforating canal. And this is spongy bone, which we're going to talk about in a minute, and they don't have osteons. They have spaces and then these little bony structures. So that's called trabeculae. And so let's take a look at that. So the other type of osseous tissue is the spongy bone. There's a picture of the spongy bone in the epiphysis. And spongy bone has more spaces than compact bone, and it has hard branching bony plates, the trabeculae, instead of osteons. Osteons go with compact bone. So the osteocytes, or bone cells, are found in the spaces between the bony plates, and then the spaces between the bony plates are also filled with red bone marrow. You can see a picture here. This is the spongy bone, and it is much spongier, or has more spaces than the compact bone. And you can see these little bony plates, and then you can see the red marrow and the spaces where the osteocytes would be. In video 2 coming up, we're going to talk about how do you grow a bone. Thank you. Bye.